Welcome to Module 7 of Human Growth and Development. In this module, we turn our attention to middle adulthood, that pivotal stretch of the life course where social, emotional, family, career, and spiritual threads come together in new ways. Over the next 25 minutes, we will move beyond the popular cultural script of the midlife crisis and engage instead with what current research, cross-cultural scholarship, and indigenous frameworks tell us about this period. Our goal is not to memorize stage theories. It is to develop a layered, equity-centered lens for case conceptualization. By the end of this module, you will be able to do 4 things. First, you will distinguish between the popular midlife crisis narrative and the broader research base on midlife transition and recalibration. Second, you will apply at least 3 developmental theories, including a culturally grounded framework, to a midlife case conceptualization. Third, you will identify the role of intersectionality, neurodiversity, and systems-level stress in midlife well-being. And fourth, you will critique deficit-based models of aging and articulate strengths-based and indigenous alternatives. Our roadmap moves from social and emotional development through theoretical foundations into family, stress, and career, and concludes with spirituality and integrative counseling implications. Throughout, we will return to one organizing question. What does it mean to develop well in middle adulthood? Let us begin with a piece of cultural mythology. The midlife crisis, as imagined in popular media, the red sports car, the affair, the dramatic break, has limited empirical support. Wethington's research found that fewer than 10 to 20% of midlife adults report experiencing what they would call a crisis, and the events they described were typically tied to specific stressors rather than to age itself. In 2015, Lockman and colleagues reframed midlife as a pivotal period rather than a crisis, characterized by the recalibration of goals, values, and relationships. This reframing matters clinically. When we approach a midlife client through a crisis lens, we may pathologize what is actually adaptive developmental work. Throughout this presentation, we will treat midlife as a period of integration and meaning-making, while staying attentive to the genuine stressors many midlife adults carry, particularly those from marginalized communities. Laura Carstenson's socio-emotional selectivity theory offers one of the most empirically supported lenses on emotional development in middle adulthood. The theory proposes that as people perceive their time horizons as more limited, their goals shift from knowledge acquisition to emotional fulfillment. This is not pessimism. It is prioritization. Midlife adults often demonstrate improved emotional regulation, greater capacity to hold complex and contradictory feelings, and a preference for depth over breadth in their relationships. They tend to invest in fewer but more meaningful connections. For counselors, this has practical implications. When a midlife client reports pulling back from a wide social network, we should not reflexively read this as withdrawal or depression. We should instead explore whether this represents intentional pruning, a reorientation toward what matters most. The clinical question becomes, are these choices aligned with the client's values, or are they avoidant? In many collectivist and indigenous communities, middle adulthood is positioned as elder in training, a time of increased social status, cultural transmission, and relational responsibility. Aldwin and Igarashi documented lower rates of midlife distress in cultures that valued aging as the accumulation of wisdom rather than as decline. Within indigenous frameworks, midlife is often when individuals step more fully into kinship roles, ceremony leadership, and stewardship of cultural knowledge. This is not a crisis. It is a calling. As counselors, we need to ask whose theory of midlife we are bringing into the room. When a client's culture frames midlife as an expansion of relational and spiritual responsibility, applying a Western crisis lens is not just inaccurate. Erik Erikson's stage of generativity versus stagnation remains foundational. Generativity refers to the impulse to contribute to future generations through parenting, mentorship, creative work, or community building. Stagnation reflects the experience of being unable to find meaningful outlets for that impulse. We should expand the concept beyond biological parenting. Generativity may take the form of being a tribal language carrier, a foster parent, a mentor in a sober community, an aunt or tio in a chosen family, or a contributor to social movements. We should also acknowledge a critique of the theory. Erikson's stages were developed primarily from observations of European and Anglo-American men, and the assumption of a linear, individualized identity arc may not fit all clients. When you encounter a midlife client expressing dissatisfaction or emptiness, consider asking, where is your contribution being received? What relationships, communities, or futures are calling for your investment? Several theorists offer complementary lenses on midlife. Daniel Levinson described midlife as a transition between life structures, in which individuals question what they have built and reconfigure for what comes next. Robert Peck identified 3 midlife tasks: shifting from physical power to wisdom, deepening relationships beyond attraction, and differentiating identity from work role. George Vaillant's longitudinal grant study found that midlife often brings a maturation of defenses, with movement from immature defenses such as projection and acting out toward adaptive ones such as humor, altruism, and sublimation. Roger Gould described midlife as the release of childhood illusions, the belief that authority will protect us, that life is controllable, and that we are exceptions to mortality. The common thread is integration. Midlife is when previously compartmentalized aspects of self, including work, body, relationships, and mortality, become woven into a coherent whole. Dan McAdams' narrative identity theory proposes that we develop selfhood by constructing an internalized life story that integrates past, present, and anticipated future. In midlife, this story often comes up for revision. Clients may begin asking, what did all of this add up to? What chapters come next? Crystal Park's meaning-making model adds that humans hold a global meaning system, our worldview about how life works, and a situational meaning, our interpretation of specific events. When these misalign, often after loss or disruption, we engage in meaning reconstruction. Viktor Frankl, writing from the survival of Nazi concentration camps, argued that the search for meaning is the primary human motivation, found through creative work, through love and experience, and through the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. These frameworks are powerful clinical anchors for clients facing major losses or transitions. Yuri Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory reminds us that midlife development does not occur in a vacuum. Middle-aged adults sit at the intersection of multiple systems. The microsystem includes immediate family and workplace relationships. The mesosystem captures the interactions among those microsystems, such as how work demands shape family availability. The exosystem includes settings the person does not directly inhabit, but which affect them, such as a partner's employer or a child's school. The macrosystem is the cultural and policy context, which dictates what midlife is supposed to look like. The chronosystem layers in historical time. As counselors, when a midlife client presents with role strain, we should resist locating the problem solely in the individual. Often, the most clinically useful question is what systems are pressing on this person at this moment, and which of those pressures are individual to address and which are structural to name. The sandwich generation refers to midlife adults who are caring for children and aging parents simultaneously. The Pew Research Center estimates that nearly a quarter of U.S. adults occupy this position, and the proportion is increasing as people live longer and have children later. We must look at the equity dimensions. Caregiving is not distributed equally. Women, particularly women of color, carry disproportionate caregiving burdens, often without compensation, paid leave, or adequate community support. Black, Latina, and Indigenous women are more likely to provide intensive caregiving across multiple generations, while also working outside the home. The cumulative cost shows up as financial precarity, sleep loss, depressive symptoms, and chronic health conditions. As counselors, we should normalize sandwich generation overwhelm without pathologizing it. We should also resist purely individualized solutions. Suggesting self-care to a woman caring for 3 generations, without naming the policy and gender dynamics that built the squeeze, is, frankly, inadequate. Several family transitions cluster in midlife. The empty nest transition is often portrayed as a loss, particularly for mothers. Recent research, however, indicates that many parents experience improved marital satisfaction, expanded personal time, and renewed identity exploration. The boomerang generation, adult children returning home, is increasingly common due to housing costs and student debt. In many cultures, multi-generational living is the norm and not a failure of launching. Counselors should explore what this arrangement means in the family's cultural framework. Grandparenting is another developmental shift. We should recognize that in many Indigenous, Black, Latino, and Asian American families, grandparents serve as primary caregivers, cultural teachers, and language carriers. This role is not a fallback. It is foundational. Counseling here often involves honoring intergenerational caregiving as a strength rather than a burden. Intimate partnerships shift in midlife. Many marriages move from the high logistical demands of early child rearing into a phase of renegotiation. Some partnerships deepen, while others reveal accumulated misalignment. The phenomenon known as gray divorce, divorce among adults over 50, has approximately doubled since 1990, while overall divorce rates have declined. This trend reflects changing norms around individual fulfillment, longer life expectancy, and greater economic options for women. For LGBTQ+ midlife adults, research consistently indicates that those in long-term, legally recognized partnerships report higher well-being and lower psychological distress than those without that legal recognition, a finding that highlights how policy shapes intimate life. As counselors, our work in this domain is not to advocate for or against any particular relational outcome. It is to help clients identify what they value, what their relationship has meant, and what an authentic next chapter would look like, always attending to safety and autonomy. Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome described the body's response to prolonged stress through 3 phases: alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. Contemporary research has expanded this model through the concept of allostatic load, developed by Bruce McEwen. Allostatic load refers to the cumulative biological wear and tear from chronic stress, as measured by markers such as elevated cortisol, blood pressure, inflammation, and metabolic disruption. By midlife, allostatic load reflects decades of exposure to stressors. The good news is that midlife adults often develop more adaptive coping. They tend to be less impulsive, more likely to plan ahead, more skilled at humor and perspective-taking, and more willing to ask for help. The clinical task is to assess how a client copes, not just what they feel. We should also ask which coping strategies are individual and which require structural support, such as paid leave, flexible work, or accessible health care. Arlene Geronimus introduced the weathering hypothesis to explain why Black women in the United States experience earlier onset of chronic illness and higher rates of pregnancy complications than would be predicted by socioeconomic status alone. Weathering refers to the cumulative health cost of navigating chronic structural racism, microaggressions, economic precarity, and caregiving overload. By midlife, the biological imprint of these stressors is visible in elevated rates of hypertension, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, and earlier mortality. This is not a failure of self-care. It is the body keeping score of decades of inequity. As counselors, we must understand that physical health complaints in midlife clients of color are not separable from race and gender stress exposure. Our clinical responses should integrate validation of these realities, advocacy where appropriate, and connection to culturally responsive medical providers. We should also examine our own assumptions about why certain bodies break down earlier than others. Next, we discuss the Big 5 personality traits, which capture variation in openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Older sources sometimes asserted that personality is fixed by age 30. The current evidence is more nuanced. Roberts and colleagues, in their 2006 meta-analysis, identified what they called the maturity principle. Most adults show modest but reliable increases in conscientiousness, agreeableness, and emotional stability through midlife. This is good news. People do continue to change, particularly when supported by meaningful roles, secure relationships, and intentional reflection. For our clinical work, this means we should not assume that a midlife client's struggles are baked in. With the right conditions, including therapy itself, real personality-level change is possible. The implication is hopeful and clinically grounded. A growing body of research and clinical literature is documenting the rise of late-life ADHD and autism diagnoses, particularly among women and people of color, who were historically underidentified. Many of these adults have spent decades masking their neurodivergent traits, attributing their struggles to personal failure, and accumulating what is often called autistic burnout or ADHD-related chronic dysregulation. When a midlife diagnosis arrives, it is often experienced as both grief and relief. Grief for the unsupported childhood, the misunderstandings, the lost opportunities. Relief at finally having a framework that fits. Our clinical task is not to confirm or deny a diagnosis, but to support identity reconstruction. We should resist deficit-based framing. Neurodivergent traits are not pathology. There are dimensional differences in attention, sensory processing, social cognition, and emotional regulation. The midlife discovery of neurodivergence is a profound recalibration of life narrative. Career development in midlife shows interesting patterns. Most midlife adults report higher job satisfaction than younger workers, a finding that has held across decades of research. They have more autonomy, more expertise, and clearer alignment between role and identity. At the same time, structural disruption is increasing. Automation, artificial intelligence, outsourcing, and economic shocks have made career transitions more common in midlife than in previous generations. Forced career change can carry a high psychological cost, including depression, identity confusion, and financial stress. Adult learners returning to school in midlife show strong cognitive performance, particularly in verbal reasoning and crystallized intelligence, but they need scaffolded support. From a counselor's perspective, work in this domain often involves grief for a discarded career identity, pragmatic skill assessment, and meaning-making about what work is for at this stage of life. Technology has reshaped midlife in ways that earlier developmental theories could not anticipate. Many midlife adults are navigating telehealth platforms, remote work, family communication through screens, and social media presentations of self. Research is accumulating on the well-being implications, with mixed findings. Connection and access can expand. So can comparison, cognitive overload, and digital fatigue. Recent work raises questions about social media's impact on adult well-being, particularly when usage is high and passive. Identity dissonance can emerge between online and offline self, especially when professional brand maintenance becomes part of work itself. As counselors, we should screen for technology-related stress, ask about digital boundaries, and support clients in using technology intentionally, rather than reactively. We should also stay humble. Many of our clients are more sophisticated tech users than we are, and the best clinical move is curiosity, not assumption. James Fowler's faith development theory positions middle adulthood at the threshold of two important stages. Stage 4, individuative reflective faith, involves taking ownership of one's beliefs, often through critical examination of the faith one inherited. Stage 5, conjunctive faith, integrates that examined faith with greater openness to paradox, mystery, and the limits of one's own framework. Wink and Dillon's longitudinal research documented that spirituality intensifies for many adults in midlife, often becoming more intrinsic, more reflective, and less institutionally bound. We should distinguish spirituality from religiosity. Spirituality refers to the personal search for meaning, transcendence, and connection. Religiosity refers to participation in organized religious practice and belief. Some clients are both. Some are one. some are neither. Our clinical role is to invite exploration without imposing assumptions, to ask what gives life meaning at this moment, and to honor whatever framework the client brings into the room. Western spiritual frameworks position the individual as the unit of spiritual development. Indigenous frameworks offer a different starting point. Terry Cross's relational worldview model, developed through the National Indian Child Welfare Association, situates the person within 4 interdependent quadrants: context, body, mind, and spirit, all in dynamic relationship with land, ancestors, and community. Spirituality in this view is not an internal experience to be cultivated. It is a relational practice that includes ceremony, kinship responsibility, language carrying, and care for the land. Horse's indigenous identity model, and the work of Winchief and Joseph, extend this by centering tribal sovereignty and place-based knowledge. The clinical implication is significant. When working with Indigenous clients, asking about individual spiritual beliefs may miss the point. The more relevant questions concern relationships, responsibilities, and connections. We should teach these frameworks as foundational alternatives, not as supplements. What does integrative practice look like with midlife clients? 6 principles converge. First, lead with strengths. Midlife clients often arrive carrying decades of demonstrated competence and adaptive coping. Find and name those strengths before exploring concerns. Second, hold both growth and grief simultaneously. Recalibration involves loss of what was, alongside the emergence of what is becoming. Do not rush the client toward resolution. Third, attend to systems. Sandwich generation stress, weathering, structural racism, and policy gaps are not background. They are foreground. Fourth, be culturally humble. Ask the client what midlife means in their cultural and spiritual framework, and let that frame your conceptualization. Fifth, affirm neurodivergence. If a client is exploring late diagnosis, support that exploration without pathologizing. Sixth, use case-based clinical reasoning. Apply theory in the service of understanding the specific person in front of you. The theory serves the client, never the other way around. Consider Rita, a 50-year-old citizen of the Potawatomi Nation. She has just become a grandmother, what her family calls kukum. She is caring for her father, who has early-stage dementia, while still parenting a teenager at home. After 22 years in corporate accounting, she is considering leaving for a teaching position at the tribal college, where she can share language and cultural knowledge. She presents with reporting fatigue, sleep difficulty, and being pulled in too many directions. Take a moment with this case. Through which theoretical lenses might you conceptualize Rita's experience? What strengths are visible? What systemic and cultural factors are pressing on her? And how might your conceptualization differ through a Western crisis lens versus an Indigenous relational frame? These are the questions your discussion forum will explore. As we close, hold 3 movements in mind. We have moved from crisis to recalibration as the central frame for midlife. We have moved from an individual to a relational and systemic unit of analysis, particularly through Bronfenbrenner, Cross, and the weathering literature. And we have moved from a deficit to a strengths orientation in shaping our clinical questions. For now, your task is to take Rita's case, or one from your own observation, and apply at least 3 theoretical lenses, including a culturally grounded framework. Bring your conceptualization to the discussion forum. Thank you for your engagement, and I look forward to reading your work. These are the references that grounded the first half of this module. These are the remaining references for the module.